So, women in leadership, yes or no? This is it's a perennial topic for students at Fuller. There's students at Fuller who come in and they're like, every pastor should be a woman. And there's students who come in and say, only men should be able to be pastors or even elders in a church. It's a pretty fraught question, and I don't want to jump into the biblical side of it because it's a pretty complex mire, and I'm a theologian. I love the Bible, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you who are curious about this. You can just text or call me about how to interpret different passages of Scripture with respect to this. But from the perspective of theology, is it possible that we've inherited from the classical tradition maybe some things that we need to reevaluate? And I think we've kind of seen that in some of the previous lectures, like, hey, God's power, we need to rethink that. Hey, God's immutability, God's passion. Let's rethink some of those things, and let's not just assume that the tradition is perfect and pure. Instead, let's look at the tradition critically, and especially in light of Scripture. Well, one of the elements of the tradition that is maybe problematic and maybe not, depending on your point of view, and we'll talk more about it as we go forward, is how we view the Trinity. Okay? For those of you who've read chapter 12 in Elizabeth Johnson's She Who Is, you'll be a little more familiar with this. But in the patristic era, when they're thinking through the Trinity, right, there was a kind of push or a desire to think hierarchically, okay? And part of that comes from Platonism and Neoplatonism. In the Neoplatonist view of the world, there is what's called, the hierarchy of being, right? Where at the very top is, if you're Christian, God, the forms, angels, humans, and beasts, and rocks, and trees, and it kind of goes down. There's being itself is ordered lesser or more perfect, right? And so humans are kind of here, and the idea probably is that we want to get to here, and there's probably a way of salvation to do that. But whatever the case, there's a kind of a top-down view about whether something is good, perfect, whatever. That kind of comes into some Trinitarian thinking and produces a model that is hierarchical. And if you think about hierarchy, and you think about the model kind of, well, it's easy to do, right? Father, Son, Spirit. Doesn't it kind of sound like the Father's up here, the boss, telling the Son what to do, and then the Son needs the Spirit to sort of pull it off, or something along those lines. You can kind of hear it in the language, the way that we even think about parents, father or son. Like, doesn't it seem as though the one with the power is the Father, and the one who's supposed to be obedient and learn how to be a decent human being is the Son, right? And so even that very language of referring to the Trinitarian persons as Father, Son, and Spirit almost creates a sort of predilection for hierarchy. The Father's the king. He's in command, tells the Son what to do. Son needs the Spirit to pull it off. And that's kind of the way of thinking. And you can see how very easy it might be if to kind of transfer that into the way we do church, right? If that's what God is like in God's self, then doesn't it seem that the church should be a reflection of that, an analogy of that, should be analogous to that, such that in traditional and very much contemporary churches, what do you see? You see leader guy, minions, and then the people that are being ministered to, I guess. And it's shocking how, especially in megachurch type evangelicalism, how common that is, right? Leader guy who's basically beholden to no one, has a staff that executes leader guy's vision, and people receive it and cheer and make the leader guy feel good about himself. Doesn't that look a little bit like this kind of hierarchical interpretation of the Trinity? Isn't there something there that is a little bit concerning? Well, Johnson kind of runs with this and suggests that one thing that we ought to recognize is that hierarchical notion really is that's not Jerusalem, that's Athens. And I just want to take a short bit of time to talk about Jerusalem versus Athens. It's very broad, and it's too broad really for use, but it's a helpful way of thinking about the way that Christian tradition developed. And that is really with Augustine in the 4th century, the marriage between the philosophy of Athens, Neoplatonism, and the theology of the Jews of Jerusalem kind of put together in a synthesis. Looking at Augustine's theology that way is really helpful. It shows it very much one of the things Augustine did is he made Christian theology acceptable to the intellectuals of his day, who were Neoplatonists of one stripe or another. He put the two systems together in a fascinating way, and not a bad thing. I mean, at the time it was monumental and still is a testament. I mean, Augustine's theology is still tremendously influential and should be. It's very, very good. But it's not perfect. And it just so happens that Augustine had some problem with women. Augustine, in his youth, was dominated by lust, and I mean, he tells us about it in the Confessions, and that worked its way into his theology to the point where he is a little bit misogynistic in the way that he thinks, and he even kind of has this like man, woman, child, or maybe man, child, woman, and he gets this from the classical tradition. Aristotle thought that called women defective men, right? Like a man who's broken is a woman. These notions are deeply connected to Western classical philosophy, the philosophy of Aristotle, Plato, and their followers. And it gets married into the Christian tradition, and this notion that everything needs to be in a hierarchy. I mean, does that seem like what we get from the Bible, from the Old Testament, right? Does the Old Testament seem to think that human relations are supposed to be like this? Well, I would suggest to you that it really doesn't. In fact, it pushes really hard against that, right? When the Israelites enter into the Promised Land, does God put a king over them? No, they're left to do their own thing, and that doesn't work out great. But it seems like God's like, I'll be your king. I'll be in charge. You just worship me, and then you do what you do. And God's kind of like hands off. Like, just as long as you love and obey me, then you live your lives and be, fruitful and multiply and prosper. It's the people who are like, we need a king. We need a royal family. We need all this. And God's like, no, that's a terrible idea. But then God's finally like, all right, if that's what you want, you can have it. But man, I'm telling you, this is going to go badly for you. There's an implicit critique of a hierarchical model in the Old Testament. And I would suggest that Jesus kind of is the full embodiment of that when Jesus totally refuses to take up power. I mean, when he's being tempted by the enemy, the devil's like, hey, you can have everything. All the kingdoms, it's all yours. And Jesus is like, yeah, no, I'm good. I would rather just obey the Father. I'm fine. It might be that the Western tradition may have been a little bit overboard on the notion of a hierarchy being the source of being. And it might be that the Trinity is not to be thought of as like Father in charge, Son here, and Spirit here, or Father, Spirit, Son, depending on how you want to organize it. Maybe that's the wrong model. Maybe the model instead should be something more relational and less top to bottom. I think what Johnson kind of suggests is let's kind of move away from this hierarchical model And she does it based in women's experience. I mean, it's a wonderful chapter. You should definitely read it, where she talks about, and I think now the language is a little bit dated and maybe a little bit condescending, but it still has value. And she says, rather than having hierarchy, why don't we think about the Trinity in terms of mutuality, right? The sharing of the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And this is very much a biblical notion, right? Like the Father is heaping glory on the Son, and the Son in return sends that glory back to the Father in the power of the Spirit. Okay, the notion that the Father's like, do this and make me glorious, that's not really how the Father's working. The Father is seeking the glory and the joy of the Son. And the Son is seeking the glory and the joy of the Father in obedience and in the sending in the Spirit to the cross. So instead of hierarchy, let's maybe emphasize mutuality. And when we're thinking about the Trinity, instead of Trinity being like how about right? More of a triangle, something that's that and maybe even like turn the triangle so it's more like right? So we the idea being, let's avoid having a top. Is there anything in Scripture that really indicates that the Father is somehow better, or the Father has probably different economic roles and different role in the immanent Trinity, but the divine persons are equal, right? So rather than emphasize the monarchy of the Father who directs the Son, who executes in the Spirit, instead recognize that the Son in equality, in divine equality to the Father, joyfully leaps at the opportunity to do the Father's will. And it's not as though the Father's sitting there like, Son, do this. And the Son's like, oh, do I have to, Dad? No, that's totally misunderstanding the role of Father and Son. It's the Son's greatest joy to be with and to fulfill the will of the Father. Nothing the Father does takes place without the Son's assent and encouragement. The Son, too, wills the Son's sending. And it's not as though the Spirit is like this kind of sort of forgotten about person of the Trinity. The Spirit is empowering and making and unifying all of it. It's not this rather than this. And then the last point that Johnson makes is communion in diversity rather than oneness or universality. The tradition of the philosophers in the West really had a push towards oneness rather than multiplicity. It very much favored the notion of a one over the many, to the point that some Neoplatonic philosophers would say that the oneness of God is the primary quality of God, because remember, anything that's different or diffused would have been imperfect. Perfection would be a unified whole on that way of thinking. And not that God isn't one. I mean, of course, the Shema tells us, God is one. Yes, absolutely. But the very notion that there is Father, Son, and Spirit, that there are these different persons to the Trinity, and they fulfill different roles, and they do so eternally, and yet are united in oneness in the midst of that. There's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for the fact that God does not exist in unqualified monotheism, is the technical term. Basically Orthodox Jewish faith, that God is completely undivided. We confess that God is one, but as Christians, we also confess that God is three, and the threeness matters. The fact that the Father can be differentiated from the Son, who can be differentiated from the Spirit, even though they are eternally united in oneness, the very fact that we can name the persons and recognize that it's the Son who does X, the Spirit who does Y, and the Father who does Z, that should tell us something about how we, by analogy, ought to be. And so Johnson says, hey, instead of, hierarchy, let's focus on mutuality. And again, it doesn't have to be replacing hierarchy. It very well might be that, we should retain some of the monarchy, because the Son does seem to, in John, follow the will of the Father. But in addition to that, let's recognize the mutuality, right? And in addition to monarchy and the Father being at the top, let's acknowledge the equality that all the persons of the Godhead are God, and they're not in submission to each other. And if the Son is submitting to the Father, it is only in the Father's mutual submission to the Son. Like, it's not just the Son doing things here. And last, communion in diversity, in addition to the focus on oneness or universality. Variegation is a good thing. If God wanted everything to be the same, God would have created a much different universe than God created. The very idea that the universe is has so much multiplicity and variety should testify to us that there's something in God that is diverse, that is multiple, that is variegated. And that's what Trinitarian does for us. Now, if you buy all of that, then it might be the case that you're willing to buy a final thing. And that is, from a theological perspective, it might be that the composition of church leadership too much reflects Athens and doesn't reflect enough Jerusalem. It might be that there's space for reconfiguring what church leadership looks like in light of the fact that God is triune, not just one. That God, in God's own being, emphasizes equality, communion despite diversity or through diversity. That element is there too. If we take that kind of Trinitarian turn and we really start to emphasize it in a way that the God's oneness has been overemphasized in the tradition, then I think that we might have some theological grounds, at least, to endorse different ways of doing church leadership. And so beyond even really just women being pastors, just the very idea that there needs to be a leader person. Like, does there? Maybe. All I'm saying is that we might have theological reasons for reformulating the way that we do church based on our understanding of what God is like in God's self. This is meant to do a couple of things, and the first is to just give a good theological kind of case for women in church leadership. The second thing it's meant to do, though, is to show that good Trinitarian thinking and good doctrine of God thinking can have really practical implications. You really can start to think through problems and experiences that we have in the church, and by relating them to God's immanent being and God's economic being, we might be able to come up with good theological reasons for reformulating various doctrines, various practices, and whatnot that we have in the church. So we really need to get doctrine of God right. This isn't just abstract. It's not just pie in the sky. It has direct implications for the way that we do life now. And I hope that as we go forward, we're going to see more and more and more of that. And so each week, we can really say, hey, here's a problem the church deals with. What does Trinitarian theology have to say to it? And hopefully come to some really cool, constructive conclusions.